Hello and welcome to China Forum, the leading program discussing the latest developments in Chinese culture, politics, and economics. My name is Betsy Gass, and I will be your moderator for this program. Today we have two very distinguished guests joining us for this show. We welcome back Dr. Robert Sutter, Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University. Before starting at George Washington, Dr. Sutter worked in multiple capacities for the U.S. government, including work with the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress, the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he has focused on his career on Asian and Pacific affairs and U.S. foreign policy. Dr. Sutter has published more than 17 books and many articles and scholarly works, and his most recent book was published in 2010, entitled U.S.-Chinese Relations, Perilous Past, Pragmatic Present. We also welcome Ms. Bonnie Glaser, who is a senior fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She analyzes issues related to Chinese foreign policy and security policy. She is also a senior associate with CSIS Pacific Forum and a consultant for the U.S. government on East Asia. Prior to joining CSIS, she served as a consultant for various U.S. government offices, including the Departments of Defense and State. Ms. Glaser has written extensively on Chinese threat perceptions and views of the strategic environment, China's foreign policy, Sino-U.S. relations, U.S.-China military ties, and cross-strait relations. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today on China Forum, we will be assessing the future of U.S. influence in Asia. The U.S. has long been a leader in the Asian arena, both economically and militarily. But over the past few decades, the rise of China and other Asian countries, coupled with serious U.S. domestic problems, has created a shift in power that has produced doubts about the future of America's leadership position in Asia. Dr. Sutter, will you explain to us a little bit about the current context of U.S. power in the Asia-Pacific? What developments in the past and more recently have provoked concern that the U.S. is losing its status as a superpower in the region?
I think the main issue that you have focused on is the issue of the rise of China. I think there's a sense on the part of a lot of observers that China's rise has really changed the whole dynamic in Asia, where the United States, it's not that the United States has really declined an awful lot, although there's some evidence of that, but that just China's rise has just been so overwhelming that a Sino-centric order has emerged in the region, according to some specialists. And so I think that that's a paradigm that exists in a lot of commentary, and it influences opinion in many parts of Asia and in the world. I don't agree with it, but it's a fact that this is taking place.
Ms. Glaser, China's growing economic influence and recent assertive stances in Asia-Pacific have directly challenged U.S. leadership in the region. Is China likely to overtake the U.S. as a regional leader?
Well, I think that China has done a great deal to increase its influence in the region in recent years, but it has a long way to go, I think, to supplant the United States. China has invested very widely throughout the region in building roads, various kinds of infrastructure, railway. Its trade with the region has increased, and its investment in the region is also increasing. But still, the U.S. investment, foreign direct investment in most of the countries, and for example, the ASEAN nations, still far exceeds that of China. So, there may come a time where China's FDI actually outpaces that of the United States. But of course, influence is measured in many, many ways. And if we look, for example, at soft power, I think that the United States has a very, very wide lead over China in that area, even though China has set up, I believe, 40 Confucian institutes in the region. A successful way to spread Chinese language and perhaps understanding of Chinese culture. But the region, almost every regional state, would like to see the United States remain very strong in the region. And as long as they do, and as long as the United States has the financial capacity, I think that the U.S. will be a very strong presence and influence in the Asia-Pacific region.
Dr. Sutter, what do you think about this? Do you think China could become a more regional leader in Asia-Pacific?
Yes, I think it could. I agree with everything that Ms. Glaser has indicated. And I would just add a couple of points that I think are pretty important in this regard. There are three dimensions that I focus on in looking at China's rise relative to the United States and Asia that I think are important. Number one, China fits into an overall pattern in Asia where the countries in the region really don't trust each other. And the reason they don't trust China is because China was so disruptive for 40 of the 60 years of the People's Republic of China. And so this is a legacy that China has to live down, and it's very difficult to do. And so when China rises, it makes the governments of the region remember the past and wonder if China is going to be disruptive again. The second thing that's important is that the governments of Asia basically are new nations in many respects. They're old countries, old cultures, but this is new nationalism, that they're very patriotic and very nationalistic. China is too. And this makes it, and what it means is that these governments really don't want to come under any country's sway. And so if it looks like China is going to be the leader of Asia, they may be a dominant force. And this is something that the other countries don't want to do. And so if they have the option of doing something else, they will choose it. And they do have that option in hedging with the United States, for example. And there are other paths that they take to do that. And then the third point I would mention is that the United States is so important for the security of the Asia-Pacific. It's the only country that's willing to undertake big costs and big commitments for the security of Asia. This is something that we need to watch and see if the U.S. will withdraw from the region and become isolationist because of its budget problems and so forth. But the U.S. is willing to do this. It has been for such a long time. It costs $50 to $100 billion a year for the United States to keep a security presence in Asia. Americans are willing to get killed, if necessary, to keep security in Asia. As my interviews with government officials throughout the Asia-Pacific region show, they say, no one else will do this, and we need it. And so this is fundamental, and China won't do this. China plays a win-win game, which is not against China. I'm not critical of China. A lot of governments do this, but they have to win in a narrow sense in what they do in the region. And if it's costly, they'll avoid it. If it's risky, they'll avoid it. They won't do these kinds of commitments that keep stability in Asia, the common goods that people talk about. These involve great cost, and the United States does it, and the governments of Asia basically appreciate it, and they're happy to work with the United States to keep a balance of influence in the region.
Well, Asian nations do seem to be a little bit wary of China as a dominant presence in the Asian arena. But the truth is that many Asian nations are becoming more and more integrated into the economy, into the Chinese economy, through their trade policies and their attractive investment policies. Is that a threat to the U.S. power there?
I would actually say that it is quite beneficial to the United States. The U.S. wants to see these countries prosper, and China is willing to invest in some ways differently than the United States does. China has invested a lot of money, for example, to build some rail that will connect Northeast Asia with Southeast Asia. They are helping some of the countries like Cambodia and Laos to build new medical facilities and to fight infectious disease. It's actually, I would say, in some ways quite complementary to U.S. investment in the region. So I think that in the long run, it really does benefit the United States if countries of the region, more people are being brought out of poverty. But if they come to see that China is the solution to their problems and the United States is absent, that's when there could be a problem. But I don't think that that is the situation today.
Do you think that they're worried that the Chinese could be integrating into the nations into a more Chinese-oriented financial system as opposed to the U.S. financial system, since it's been having such problems lately with the 2008 financial crisis and with the current debt impasse that we're at?
Well, I think there is absolutely a concern that in terms of finances, that the region could be more dependent on China and on the Chinese currency in the future. China has very cleverly created these swap regimes with some countries, such as South Korea and Indonesia, where they can ensure that there is no shortage of foreign exchange, and they can help to finance projects in the region. They are developing they're developing a China-ASEAN development fund, which was established a couple of years ago, which I believe is about $10 billion that will be used for support for projects, through development projects throughout the region. And this is where the United States really has to compete in terms of their investment in the region. The United States recently established a Lower Mekong Initiative, very important centerpiece of the Obama administration's approach to the region. And so I think the countries of the region really welcome that. As Dr. Sutter said, it's a balance. The countries of the region don't want to be too dependent on China. I don't think that the dollar is likely to be replaced anytime soon as the major reserve currency by China's currency, the yuan. But if the United States does not manage its finances well, then in the future there could be more and more countries that want to see different arrangements. And China itself has been supporting actually using SDRs as a reserve currency. And there are other countries that support that as well. So there's a lot of discussion in the international community and the Asia-Pacific community about what direction to go in terms of global finances.
If I could just add on, when I look at this China-centered economic order that you've been talking about, there's a couple of benchmarks that I keep in mind. Number one, that China is a big trader for these countries, but half of China's trade is controlled by foreign invested enterprises in China. It's a very interdependent trade. Half of China's trade with the region, more than half, is processing trade, where the commodity goes back and forth across the border. And when it's finally produced, it's often finished in China, but then it's exported out of China. And it's heavily dependent on export markets for China. And the biggest export markets for China are the European Union and the United States. So it's a very interdependent type of relationship. And then when you look at Chinese investment, the flow of investment on the part of the Asia-Pacific and China has been heavily one way. It's been Asian investment into China. Recently, China has invested to some degree in certain areas, but it's really pretty small up to this point. Grossly, China is the 5th largest investor in the world today. In the case of Asia, the biggest recipient of Chinese investment is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a tax haven. And about 30 to 40% of that goes back to China. And so you're dealing with some spongy figures here, and one needs to just keep it in mind. The basic point I'm getting at is the interdependent nature of the Chinese economic order in the region, and the still limitations of China as an investor in the region, and China and how this can limit to some degree the salience of China's economic power in Asia Pacific.
Well, looking at China's military, we've seen recently that they've had a huge buildup in their naval presence, and with the building of the aircraft carrier and some of their more aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. Is that a worry for the U.S. military presence in Asia? Should that be a large concern? Do we need to protect the other Asian nations that hold sovereignty rights in the South China Sea?
Well, China is certainly developing its military, though I would be careful to not overstate what it has accomplished so far. In the next 10 to 20 years, China's Navy in particular will acquire far greater capabilities than it has today. The Chinese today are primarily concerned with establishing their control over what they refer to as the near seas, the Yellow Sea, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea. And the Chinese are particularly concerned that in a crisis, that the United States could intervene in these waters. And so they are developing what we refer to, and this is a foreign term, particularly a US term, not a Chinese term, anti-access and area denial capabilities that will make it very costly for the United States to operate in those waters in a crisis. But the states in the region, of course, have concerns about China's increased naval presence, and this is not only really the Chinese Navy, but they have other maritime organizations that are responsible for protecting fisheries, for example. They have a fleet of patrol boats that they are deploying in the South China Seas and also in the East China Sea. And this is where they have disputed territories with some of their neighbors. Recently there was an incident where a Chinese boat severed the cable of a Petro-Vietnam survey vessel that was doing surveying for exploration of oil and gas in the region. And this was, of course, seen as very worrisome, not just by Vietnam, but by the entire region. And there have been other incidents with the Philippines. The United States doesn't take a position on these disputed territorial issues. The U.S. and the Obama administration has really made quite clear recently at the ASEAN Regional Forum that was just held last week, and of course a year prior at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, that the U.S. has an interest in peaceful resolution of disputes, freedom of navigation, and open commerce. And the resolution of these issues, these disputed territories, in accordance with international law. But the United States is not likely to get involved militarily with these disputes in any way.
One of the points I would add, I think this is excellent, and one of the points I would add about this situation has to do with the balance of influence in the region. China wants to expand its influence in the Asia-Pacific region. And one of the main ways they've been doing this in the past decade has been to reassure their neighbors, reassure them that China will not be a dominating power. And so the diplomacy is very much focused on this reassurance approach. And yet these military actions and these actions by these survey ships and these paramilitary ships that the Chinese send to regulate fishing and other things like that, these all are disconcerting to the governments of Asia. And what do? Well, they make these governments wary. They undermine the reassurance that China's been giving them. And it comes at a time when the Obama government is very active in politically and otherwise re-engaging, they call it, in Asia, building up American relationships across the board in the Asia-Pacific region. And so the Obama government finds itself pushing on an already opening door. These governments are very interested in having this kind of interaction because the Chinese are behaving in this way. And the net result for China is a real problem for their efforts to spread their influence in the Asia-Pacific on the basis of reassurance. It doesn't work. And they're clashing with their goals are clashing. And this is I think this contradiction needs to be highlighted because it shows that China's rise is full of complications as it rises in influence in Asia. It's not easy to do this. And this is one of the big hurdles they've encountered over the last year or two.
How accurate is it to say that U.S. policy in Asia is focused on the containment of China via its military or its economic policies?
I think that's As you can see, I'm an old person. I remember containment. Containment was quite real. It was very, and when the U.S. government ended containment of China, this happened in the late 1960s, it began then, the U.S. withdrew 650,000 troops from the Asia-Pacific region. That's what containment involved in those days. And if you wanted to contain China today, you'd probably need 3 times that military deployment. So it's, I think the U.S. put aside containment a long time ago. What the Obama government is doing is re-engaging with Asia to build up relationships with the various countries of Asia, and at the same time to engage with China very actively too. And so this kind of approach is seen as very much in the interest of the United States. There is a problem here because many Chinese commentators are distrustful of the United States. And so they see this kind of engagement, which is heavily diplomatic. It's manifest in trade and military relationships and so forth. But they point to this type of engagement as containment, which I think is just ridiculous from anybody that remembers containment. But they nonetheless feel that way, and so it's an issue that reflects the lack of trust between the Chinese and the Americans. But in short, my short answer is no, the U.S. isn't engaging in containment. We gave that up a long, long time ago.
You know, it's quite clear, I think, that if the United States wanted to prevent China from reemerging as a great power, we would not have engaged in a series of policies that we have engaged in fact, over the last several decades. And one in particular that I think was especially important was welcoming and urging China to join the World Trade Organization, which China has benefited from immensely. And so, as Dr. Sutter says, this is a narrative that is internal to China. The United States certainly could not contain China's rise if we wanted to, because no country in the world would collaborate with the United States in such an effort. And the United States would see no value in doing so, in part because of our tremendous interdependence with China. So people in the United States do not treat China in the same way as we did the Soviet Union. We have immigration that comes from China. We banned immigration from the Soviet Union. We have a huge amount of trade with China and, of course, a huge trade deficit with China. We discourage trade with the Soviet Union. We don't look at China as an enemy. We don't think about how we need to have mutually assured destruction with China. We don't think about how to prepare to have a nuclear war with China, although there may be a few people in our military who have to think about those issues. It doesn't really dominate the minds of policymakers in the same way that it did when we were really in the Cold War. So this is a narrative that the Chinese, I think, government actually encourages through education. And it serves the interest of the Chinese government in some ways, though I think in others it makes it more difficult for the Chinese leadership to manage the relationship. So there are times when the Chinese government wants the people to be critical of the United States or Japan or other countries, and then there are other times that they want to promote support for the relationship. And I think it becomes very, very difficult for them to do that.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask you one last question. What future priorities lie in Asia? What improvements can the U.S. make to establish ourselves as the leading power in the region? What can we cooperate? How can we cooperate with China to further some of our goals there?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that we can do with other countries and then also with China. When I talk to people from the region, they tell me that the Chinese activities in the region have far greater visibility than the United States has, and they call for the U.S. to do more in areas of environment and education and disaster or emergency preparedness, things that will really help the people on the ground. So that they will see the influence in a way that they really do see China's influence and welcome it. So that's one thing that I think the U.S. can do. And as I said earlier, I think we're beginning to do this, for example, in the Lower Mekong Initiative, but I think we need to do more of that. In terms of cooperation with China, we are just beginning in the Obama administration to try and identify some joint projects that we can do with China to bolster confidence in the region that the U.S. and China can get along, because countries in the region actually get quite nervous about the potential for real strategic friction and competition between our two countries. One of the things that we're doing now is an agricultural project with the Chinese in Timor-Leste that was just announced by Secretary Clinton in Bali this past week. And we are also engaging in a project in disaster relief. And there is great potential in that area as well. And I would also add counter-piracy as an area where we could work with China. We have been doing so in the Gulf of Aden, and we could do more with China in any counter-piracy efforts in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, I agree with Bonnie completely on this one, and I think that just a couple of thoughts on this question, which I think would be helpful. One is to recognize that the Obama government is really following a policy which I think is very constructive, and it has a high profile. And if you want visibility for the United States, all you have to do is send the Secretary of State. And if she comes and shows up, she brings a whole bunch of media with her. You get a very high profile for the United States because of the nature of the commitment of the Secretary of State, and I think the Secretary of Defense was also very committed to Asia. And so I think this showing up and being present and supporting the governments is very important. And then I think understand the depth of the American relationship with Asia. This is something that I find people don't understand very well at all. Because if you measure the activities of the Chinese government and the activities of the American government, that's not really fair from the American point of view. The heavy burden of American interaction with Asia is non-governmental, has been for 2 centuries. And these people are everywhere in Asia, whether it's business, media, foundations, educational organizations, and so forth. And they're all doing their own thing in Asia, and it's heavily positive. And many governments don't have this, and China doesn't have this. Most of China's activities in Asia are governmental. And so I'm not sure how you leverage this, but understand the base. The base of the United States in the region is very, very important. As far as the governments are concerned, they're fundamentally concerned with the U.S. security role in the region, which I've already indicated, and the perseverance in that role. And they'll watch that very carefully. And the second thing is that the U.S. is very important for them economically. Because very few places in the world will absorb their exports. They're export-oriented economies. They export to China, but this is part of that processing trade. And they recognize China continues to run a trade surplus. So where does it ultimately wind up? Well, it ultimately winds up in European Union and the United States. And this is very important for these governments as well, that the U.S. will keep an open market and keep a commitment strategically to the region. And I think the Obama government is committed to this. I'm unsure as to whether the U.S., I think we need to watch whether the U.S. in this time of domestic economic distress will cut back seriously in this regard. And I'm watching that carefully.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sutter and Ms. Glaser, for coming with us today. And thank you to our audience at home, and we'll see you again next time on China Forum.